Thank you, everyone, for joining in your morning or your afternoon or your evening. And welcome to this second STAP briefing, jointly convened with the Global Environment Facility. I think most of you know me by now. I'm Rosina Bierbaum, and I'm very proud to be the chair of the Scientific and Technical Advisory Panel. And it's a privilege to open this session and set the stage for what I hope will be a truly engaging and practical learning experience. To deepen our understanding of two essential topics for designing effective GEF projects. The first is developing a systems-based theory of change, and the second is clarifying project and program risks with emphasis on encouraging innovation risks. And in a minute, Fred Boltz, the manager of the programming division of the GEF Secretariat, will add his welcome to mine. I believe he's just returned from extensive travel. And as all of you know, the STAP, as we call the Scientific and Technical Advisory Panel, provides a wide range of guidance. But these two topics were prioritized by GEFSEC. And because time is short, we'll have to focus on the highlights. And many more details are in the advisory documents that we'll provide on our website and in the slides. And we absolutely encourage your feedback on what more on these topics or other topics you'd like to hear in the future. Both theory of change and risk appetite have now been codified by the GEF and the Council as key ingredients for good project design. And both began with papers that STAP offered some time ago. A theory of change is not just a formality. It is the foundation for designing projects that end up being both strategic and evidence-based and further adaptable. A theory of change helps us articulate how and why change is expected to happen and underpins that with the assumptions and causal pathways so that we can achieve durable global environmental benefits. And a strong theory of change also supports monitoring, evaluation, and learning. On risk, we all know that GEF projects involve risk, but innovation, by its very nature, carries additional uncertainty. However, we also know that to achieve transformational change, we need to try novel approaches, reduce unintended consequences, and ensure accountability without discouraging bold ideas. So the training is going to touch on completing the now required risk table in GEF projects. And my two senior STAP advisors, who you can see on the screen, will be conducting these briefings. Dr. Mark Stafford Smith will lead the session on theory of change, and Dr. Blake Ratner will lead the session on clarifying risks. And they will explain why these are important and then take you through an example of how to do these in your project design. And we are taping this so that we can share it with you if you would like, simply for your use and summary. Again, if people want to stay on at the end of the hour, our briefers will stay on to answer questions. So Sunday, if Fred Boltz has arrived, we will turn it over to him. Do you see him?
Yeah, Fred is here.
Fred, over to you.
Thank you, Rosina. Thank you, Sunday, so much for sending the link. My apologies for the delay. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, everyone. Thank you so much for joining. And thank you, Rosina, for setting the scene for this important training. GEF Agencies, project designers, technical staff, delighted that you could join us today. This is extremely important to the GEF, as your role is really central to making sure that the potential of the GEF in the financial resources that we're mandated to deploy and the strategies that we develop in consultation with you are translated into real world impact through your partnership with recipient countries in the design and development of good projects. This training workshop comes at a very important moment. As you all are certainly aware, we are in the process of concluding GEF 8. We have just over a year to go. to mobilize all of GEF 8 resources in soundly designed projects generated global environmental benefits, and preparing for GEF 9, which will launch in July of 2026. And as we look to GEF 9, we want to take stock of experiences and learning in GEF 8 related to the quality of project design, particularly in terms of strategic clarity, the fundamental theories of change that guide your logic in designing projects and deploying investments across different strategic interventions, as well as your assessment and implementation in the context of risk. As you know, the GEF has been encouraged to take a high risk appetite. Innovation is very central to what we hope to do to address our daunting mandate of helping countries achieve their global environmental benefits in a planet that's under change and a civilization that is under significant change and disruption, particularly today. So having a keen sense of how to understand and manage risk of various forms and to engage in with a high risk appetite in innovative and high leverage opportunities is really fundamental to achieving the ambitious goals that we've set for the GEF and for the global environmental community through agreements to multilateral environmental agreements. A well-developed theory of change and a thoughtful approach to risk are really essential to how the GEF assesses, approves, and monitors the portfolio projects that we oversee, and fundamental to achieving the GEF's core mandate. And that's a core mandate to which the entirety of the GEF partnership, of course, contributes, and implementing agencies and executing agencies are on the front lines of delivering that impact. Today we'll have some extremely helpful presentations by Mark Stafford Smith and Blake Ratner, who did a preview with my technical team here at the GEF of theory of change and risk approaches. This is something that our team also greatly benefits from and learns from in our partnership with the staff. I'm sure that you'll find their presentations also extremely useful, insightful, as you also think about enhancing project design and enhancing the coherence and effectiveness of your work. I should note also that this is something that the GEF Council also looks at very, very keenly. The GEF Council has been extremely supportive of the important role of the STAP in bringing scientific and technical knowledge, latest cutting-edge tools and approaches and innovations to the GEF, and partnering with us to better articulate our approach to embracing calculated risks, our approach to designing programs for transformative impact, and also our approach to assessing the robustness and resilience of our project portfolio in achieving and sustaining global environmental goals. So this is very, very central to everything that the GEF does. It's something that the GEF Council strongly encourages us to continue to assess, learn from, and adapt to strengthen our portfolio overall. So very much appreciate your time engaging in this training. I want to encourage you to fully engage in this training. Ask all the hard questions. No questions are off the table. This is really time for you to better understand and dialogue with the experts on theories of change, on innovation and risk assessment and management. And so get in there, roll up your sleeves, and push the boundaries in your discussions with Mark and Blake during the next hour plus, I should say. Thank you so much for your time. Thanks to dear colleagues Rosina, Mark, and Blake at the STAP, and Sunday as well for your great efforts. And I think next over to you, Mark, to take us on this journey. Thanks again.
Cool. Thanks, Fred. Thanks, Rosina. And yes, let's get into it. So Blake and I are going to speak for about 20 minutes or so each on the two topics. But please put questions and thoughts and comments as hard as you like, as Fred says, into the chat there, and we'll try and answer them as we go. But if not, pick them up at the end or afterwards. So hopefully you can see my screen, and I'm just going to start off with one quick slide, just framing these two topics in the context of STAP's role And so this will be familiar to some of you, but just very, very, very briefly to say that STAP's role in the GEF partnership really has these three elements, partly an advisory one of bringing the sort of most recent science to the GEF, but also to the GEF partnership, but also to take some of GEF's needs back to the science community. It has the role around quality control in project screening, which you'll be familiar with. And then it also has a role in a sort of a more diverse and diffuse suite of approaches to support more generally, including things like this training. We do produce a series of technical guidances, often in reports, and these can either be focused on particular topics like nature-based solutions, perhaps, or be more process-oriented, like the things that we're talking about today. We have over time collated some of what we feel are some of the key, what we've termed enabling elements for good project design that sort of try and draw on what is undoubtedly an evolving landscape of best practice, and they're to be found in a document which is called our enabling elements. And they basically are summarized in these 8 items, which I'm not going to go through, but please do have a look at it if you're interested. They're sort of 8 things which we will particularly look at when we're screening projects. Not the only things, but they are sort of key process aspects. And the talks that we're giving today relate directly to 2 of these. To the first one up in the top left there of applying systems thinking and theory of change. And in the bottom right, investing in purposeful innovation and taking a purposeful approach to risk in doing that. So I won't say any more about that, but that's just the sort of framing of where we're coming from here. So on theory of change, Rosina, well, both Rosina and Fred have already introduced some of the rationale for doing this. Just to speak very briefly to our intent here, obviously the intent of theory of change in general is to help produce better interventions, as they both mentioned already. And do that by taking a sort of logical, structured way to trying to think through whether and why and how the proposed actions in an intervention are going to actually lead to the intended results, which in the case of GEF are going to include enduring global environmental benefits, but potentially other co-benefits as well. Why would STAP bother to put together a primer on this? Well, I mean, because there is in fact plenty of existing resources in the online, in consultancies, and certainly in expertise in the agencies. But I guess we took the approach of, and so we're not trying to reinvent all of this. We're not trying to create a new theory of change process. We very much reviewed a whole stack of approaches in the literature and just tried to bring them together to provide a sort of consistent approach to theories of change in the GEF context, which might both help strengthen them, but also make it easier for us to see in a consistent way whether a good theory of change process has been followed. So that's sort of the rationale for this, and hopefully it's a useful one to all of you. It's worth saying that there are many ways really of having a good design logic to projects. And indeed, there are many approaches in detail to theory of change too. I think there are a few key features of what we're going to talk about today, which are really important in getting good logic design, and I'll try and point those out. If you happen to be doing a different particular process, but that has those same characteristics, that's fine. If you're doing a theory of change process that purports to be theory of change that don't have those, then that's perhaps not so good. There's some discussion of this in a set of frequently asked questions in the primer, in the STAP's theory of change primer. Let me start into the content here just by saying briefly that that we have a set of sort of definitions which we use consistently. I don't think there's anything particularly obligatory about using these terms in these particular ways, but it's important to understand that if you do use terms like outcomes and impacts differently in your organization, then this is how we would translate them. So we see theory of change as really being constructing a set of causal pathways that lead from, which are illustrated here, which lead from the sort of inputs into a project or a program, or in fact any sort of intervention, but I'll talk about them as if they're projects. A set of inputs into these projects that might be staff, might be financing, might be existing relationships with stakeholders, and so on. taking those inputs, carrying out a series of activities within the project to produce some sort of well-specified outputs. That much is very much in the sphere of control of the project and the players there. But beyond that, we're then wanting those outputs to influence the outside world, to create some shorter and longer term outcomes, to take up the information or the practices and actually do them themselves outside the project. And then, of course, we want to have a rationale as to why those outcomes are likely to lead to the impacts and goals that we're seeking to get. So this is a sort of key idea here, and associated with this will be some assumptions which say something about how reliable we believe some of those logical links down those causal pathways are, and if they're not so reliable, what we need to do to keep track of whether they're playing out as we expect. So that's a little bit of definitions. What are the reasons for doing theory of change? I mean, obviously, the key one, which we've already mentioned, is to make projects more effective, and in particular to do that by bringing in some diverse sources of understanding. So we're almost always dealing with relatively complex social ecological systems here, and different people will have different mental models about how they work and about how interventions will affect them. So it's very important to bring that in. And we're really about trying to open up what I always love in this old cartoon here, that little miracle in the middle there, that is liable to be left out of people's logic, that explains why we expect doing certain things will actually lead to the outcomes that we want. However, there are at least these other three key reasons for doing theories of change processes. There is the whole process of engaging people in the project, and that may be the team itself, helping everyone to get on the same page and have at least a common understanding of why the intervention's being done, which may be particularly important when members of the team turn over. But it's also important for engaging others outside who may be partners or stakeholders who may be really important for project delivery or durability of the outcomes, or indeed for scaling. A third reason is for communication. It's my strong belief that theory of change is a fantastic communications tool, which allows you to sort of quickly and logically summarize what may be quite a complex project rationale and components. And people often come at us sort of saying, well, theory of change is yet another thing to do in a project proposal. But really, doing a theory of change well substitutes for a large part of the material in a project proposal and provides a nice, concise, logical way which can very readily be apprehended by readers and by people who are screening projects, and by people like the council members. And then the fourth reason is for measuring and learning and understanding by identifying assumptions that need to be tracked, whether there are key things which we need to be aware of, which may not be playing out how you intend during the course of an intervention, which might lead to the need for adaptive management. So those four reasons are all important, and they result in slightly different ways of doing particular theory of change processes. And there's a table in the primer, table 1, which talks about that and gives some insights into that. I want to just pick up 3 ideas here before we go on. Firstly, the idea that there is then a theory of change process and a theory of change product. So we tend to think of a theory of change as being a diagram on a page. I'll talk later that the diagram by itself is not enough, but in any case, really the key thing about theory of change is going through the process which engages people and brings in that wider range of knowledge, as well as, of course, producing some sort of product out of it. So keeping the idea that there are both of those things in mind is really important. I've already mentioned the fact that assumptions, that you can identify testable assumptions about the logic, and that's another really important concept here, which we'll touch on again during this talk. And then thirdly, I want to introduce this idea that I go on about a lot, which is the idea of being necessary and sufficient. So when we're thinking about these, about a collection of these causal pathways in order to deliver some outcomes, we should always be asking, we're quite good at thinking about ones which are necessary, so you may need some additional knowledge, but we're much less good about thinking about whether the set of pathways is sufficient to achieve those outcomes. So I think we all know that just delivering more knowledge to people doesn't guarantee that there'll be behavior change or other sorts of changes. And so thinking clearly about whether things are not only necessary but sufficient and is a really important aspect. And I'll come back a bit to that through this talk. Okay, a couple of quick slides which just summarize some stuff which you can find more detail about in the primer. First one is when to do a theory of change. So STAP strongly urges people to do at least a lightweight theory of change brainstorming very early on in your project design process, and certainly before you produce a PIF, a project information form, if in the current system. This really helps get the initial logic framed. It gets that sort of small team that may be developing the thing on the same page, and it certainly helps to communicate the general intention of what you're going to do. Of course, you would then expect that to be further developed as you do more theory of change processes, bring in other views, bring in other stakeholders, which may well cause some of that initial logic to get changed a bit during the course of the design process, and by the time you finish that design process, to have a consolidated, complete theory of change for sign-off. But then the theory of change again becomes important for a structured revisiting of whether things are playing out as expected, which provides some sort of constraints on the flexibility that you might have in adaptive management of a project during the lifetime of the implementation. And then it becomes important again to frame evaluation and learning in terminal evaluations, and indeed after that, as the IEO will tell you. So there's more about that in the primer again. There's also a lot more in the primer about this, which I'm going to zoom through very quickly, which is about the actual doing of a theory of change. So in our review of all of these online and other processes, we were able to draw out basically a set of consistent of eight steps, which broadly the vast majority of those processes had in them.
I'm on a webinar. I should have turned my remote off.
Can I ask people to just turn their microphones off? That would be great, please. So there's these 8 steps there. It's not particularly critical whether they're done in precisely this order, and some of them need to be a bit iterated anyway, but they identify the sort of key elements which are needed in a good theory of change. The primer has a extensive table which really talks about a lot of detail about these steps and provides some hints and guidelines as to how they can be carried out. And so in terms of actually practically doing a theory of change, I'll refer you to there, and I'll mention it again at the end. Now, I want to take a few minutes to just work through what is inevitably a very simplistic little example here, but to draw out some of the issues that I've been mentioning. So I'm going to sort of pseudo go through a bit of a theory of change process here. So we've got the sort of general GEF long-term goal of producing durable and scaled global environmental benefits from GEF investments, which is off on the right there. And within that, we might have a project or a group of projects which have got a goal of creating a specified degree of biodiversity and perhaps carbon global environmental benefits, which are durably scaled to the whole of a significant biome. So, for example, the Miombo woodlands, which is a biome in southern Africa that runs across 6 or 7 countries. So, if we accept that as a goal, then the key thing in a theory of change is to start asking, what are the longer term outcomes that we need to achieve if we're going to deliver that goal eventually, and what are the sorts of barriers and challenges and indeed also opportunities at this particular point in time that may inhibit or enable us to achieve some of those outcomes. So if we take that goal, there might be a couple of in a case study region, there might be a couple of longer term outcomes that we want to achieve, improved actual management of the Miombo there, but also perhaps the prerequisite co-benefits of some secure and resilient livelihoods for the farmers managing these, in order that they're keen to maintain that better management. And if we start to work back from achieving that improved management in the test region, we might argue that one of the steps towards that is to have a critical mass, perhaps 50% of farmers take up a set of better management practices, sustainable land management practices. And in order to achieve that, looking at the sort of barriers that there are in the region, we might identify the need to source, test, and identify and promulgate a particular set of better land management practices. So that could be one causal pathway that we would be thinking about in contributing to the outcomes there. But here we start to come to this question of is that particular causal pathway necessary? Yes, probably necessary if there's a lack of information, but is it sufficient? Well, clearly that by itself is not going to achieve everything that's on the right-hand side there. At the very least, we might start thinking about addressing the lack of community support by creating an active cadre of extension officers, community extension officers in the community, or some other approach like this that enables that. Is that necessary and sufficient? Well, necessary again, perhaps, but at least in some of these countries, we know that tenure security is another significant issue. And so certainly in terms of sufficiency, we need to address that as well. So there might be an element of activity going on, another causal pathway where there is engagement with country ministries about policy reform. You manage to get better tenure security established. And we also might, as we start to think about these things and elaborate them a little, recognize that just having farmers take up the better management practices isn't enough. We need them to actually demonstrate the better livelihoods and pass that demonstration on to others. And so you start adding a bit of extra detail into the diagram here. Now, if we look at the actual goal, though, it's to scale all of this to the whole Miombo, to the whole biome, and so I mean, we next need to ask, well, is there in fact a separate scaling pathway needed? Do we need to think about that as well? And that might through addressing some of these issues around South-South exchange, which might engage surrounding countries and perhaps regional farmer associations early on, so that the awareness of these better management practices and their benefits for livelihoods is spread more widely through the other countries of the region. And it's really important, even if the capacity of the project itself is only to do a pilot study in one region, it's really important to be thinking about these scaling issues right at that stage, both because we want to make sure that it is actually we can actually see how scaling might happen, so it's plausible that it's feasible, but also because there may be just some initial activities during the course of the pilot study that can make the scaling easier later. In this case, it might be that you actively get those regional farmers associations to come and visit the test area early on in the whole process. Now, this also highlights something about this whole necessary and sufficient issue, which is I think it's really important to identify all the things that are necessary and sufficient for achieving the outcomes, even if the project can't actually deal with them all. So, for example, in this case, it might be that the tenure security policy work is being done by a different project or a different group, and you don't have the capacity or the right skills to do it in the project that we sort of first started talking about that might be more on ground. But if the tenure security issue is one which, in the absence of dealing with it, we're never going to get uptake of these management practices, then it's really important that we recognize that that is another element that has to be done. That it is part of having a sufficient set of causal pathways. It's important that we recognize that even for the project that's only going to do the on-ground work, because in the best of cases, someone else is doing it, and you want to make sure that the projects are aligned so that the tenure security issues have been dealt with by the time that you're encouraging the farmers to take up the management practices. In the worst case, there might be no one doing that other essential thing. And then you might want to stop and question whether it's even worth doing the work that you were proposing if some other critical barrier isn't being addressed. So I really urge people to think a lot about this issue of necessary and sufficient. And the other thing I hope I've really demonstrated here, and which is a crucial aspect, I think, of doing a theory of change well, is that theory of change is about working back from your goals and your longer term outcomes to work out what are the necessary and sufficient things to achieve them. We're all too easily can slip into just wanting to do some work on new land management practices and then sort of think about how they might be vaguely useful to achieve the goal. But if we're really seriously trying to achieve change in the ground, then we need to work the other way and make sure that we're thinking about all the elements, all the causal pathways that are necessary to achieve the outcomes that we're seeking. All right, well, that's a little bit about a very simple theory of change process. I just want to talk about briefly here about the fact that people may feel that this is a complicated sort of thing to do, but you can do it anywhere really. On the left here is a shot of a GEF project actually developing a theory of change in a schoolroom in a remote Ethiopian village, small village. On the right, there's one being developed in the hotel foyer in Xi'an in China. So you can do them in all sorts of different places. People engage with them surprisingly and exceptionally well. And these days, you can also do them, in a very dispersed way online on online whiteboards like Miro or others that enable people to get together and in 2 or 3 sort of 1-hour sessions put an extraordinary amount of information together for a theory of change, even if they're in very different places. So this is very achievable. Moving on from the theory of change process to the theory of change product, as I mentioned earlier, people do think of the product as being the diagrams, and there's a whole diverse set of representations here. Some of them are much better than others, but the primer talks a bit about the good and bad aspects of these sorts of images, and images have different purposes for communication, of course, too. But you can easily access a whole variety of them with this is just a Google image search here. The important thing, though, I really want to say about the theory of change product is that it should never just be a diagram. At least as important, if not more important, is the narrative that goes with it, which needs to contain at least these sorts of elements, which again are listed in the primer, which really, if you think about it, largely takes up the majority of a project proposal description. Of course, there are some other aspects that need to be covered too, but it covers an awful lot of it and provides a very concise and logically structured basis for an intervention. So lastly, my last slide here, just to say that the primer then roughly follows this presentation with a fair bit of extra detail about actual practicalities for carrying out a process in that table too. It talks a little bit about how to assess a theory of change also, plausibility, feasibility, testability, and having the mandate and buy-in. You can pick it up at that location or by Googling GEF STAP theory of change primer, which will should take you straight there. And I would just highlight again that there are many online resources for doing theory of change, and quite a few of these are referenced in the primer, although that will rapidly go out of date for those. And there is a little discussion in the primer about getting help with doing a theory of change, what you should ask. For example, a consultant, if you're thinking of taking one on to help you do a theory of change, that would ensure that they're likely to do something that satisfies these sorts of approaches. And there's a set of frequently asked questions that I mentioned. My very last word is just to say the theory of change is never completely perfect. Don't waste time over-engineering it. It's much more important to be useful and evolving than to be perfect and set in stone. And in relation to that, I think it's really important that you think a bit about the balance between comprehensiveness and communicability. So often creating a theory of change is quite a complex process. It's very useful to have the full complexity there, but you may not want it as the main communications device in a project proposal. So you may want to have a simpler summary logic explanation of the logic for the proposal, but we should all value having the more complicated and more comprehensive representation, perhaps in an annex, which illustrates that the processes have been thought through properly and provide the additional information that people who are really engaged in the project might need. All right, thank you. Over to you, Blake.
Thanks very much, Mark. As I mentioned earlier in the chat, and as Rosina mentioned, please do add questions in the chat. Mark will be able to respond to those in the chat itself, and then to be able to stay on after the second presentation as well. And I see that John Morrison has already put a question there, which relates to the issue of the risks around assuming that behavioral change will happen. And so it's a good segue to this second topic that Fred also highlighted as central to our ability to achieve the big ambitious changes that the GEF is aiming to achieve through its investments. So this presentation is going to focus on that question of risks in GEF projects with a particular emphasis on innovation risks. To set the stage for that a little bit, I think it's important to step back and look at how these topics link together, the topics of transformation, innovation, and risk, because as it's been established in GEF 8 and indeed since GEF 7, the GEF's commitment to transformational change is clear. What this requires is a willingness to take on significant innovations, and with that, often necessarily a good degree of risk as well, in the sense of uncertainty about the ability to achieve those innovations and ultimately those transformational changes. So in STAP's perspective, it's really important to be able to make sure that we get operational about how these concepts can be put into practice. So we've tried to provide a good bit of guidance on these themes. First, on the focus on transformation. This is an image from our multi-stakeholder dialogue advisory document, which specifies the ways in which, or at least some of the ways in which innovative pilot efforts can be scaled through alternative pathways. And this requires different types of innovation, addressing distinct barriers to change, and different types of scaling that ultimately lead to transformations for which we need different metrics to be able to make sure that we're actually measuring progress along these pathways. We've also developed guidance, this is from our Achieving Transformation advisory document, about thinking through this process to get operational about ambitions for transformational change. This is more than I'll get into in detail here, but just wanted to flag that it's available and point out that there really is a need for rigorous selection in terms of what are the different types of innovations and interventions that will be supported to match the ambition of transformational change. And Mark alluded to some of these as well in the discussion of necessary and what was it, Mark? Adequate and necessary. So on the innovation theme in particular, what STAP has pointed out previously is that there really are quite a few different types of innovation around technologies, policies, institutions, business models, financing mechanisms. And each of these is important to consider when we look at what are the routes to achieving the transformational change that each project or program is aiming to contribute to. So here are a few examples about the different sort of large models that we might think about in terms of scaling innovations around production systems that might move from one landscape to broader scales, about value chains that can contribute to shifts at broader international scales, financing systems that can be integrated to be more mainstreamed in the way that finance is pooled and invested, and shifts in service provision that can make big changes in terms of the availability of different opportunities for consumers and for small-scale producers. So with each of these types of innovation, we urge a consideration of the broader scaling pathways that you're aiming to pursue. Now, I mentioned earlier that risk is often something that comes along with greater innovation. In this image, we've tried to simplify that by putting these together. Innovation and risk, of course, are distinct, but nevertheless, it's often the case that to achieve the higher scale of impact requires a greater deal of innovation and therefore a greater degree of uncertainty and risk. The risk appetite framework that STAP has promoted and that the Council has now adopted includes the notion of an overall statement of intent, which is the risk appetite statement, operational policies and procedures and metrics and monitoring systems to underpin that. And Each of these is important to be able to have shifts in practice throughout the broader partnership. Now, luckily, the GEF risk appetite has been adopted by Council, as both Rosina and Fred referred to. It's been a bit over a year now, and this framework is distinct from what was in place in prior years, and particularly as it relates to the risk table in project documents. So this framework for risk appetite distinguishes across 3 dimensions of risk to achieving project outcomes: context, innovation, and execution, and beneath each of those 3 different categories. So what I'd really like to emphasize as well is the way in which the GEF risk appetite document provides not only an ability, but in fact an invitation to take on high risk innovations when they are well connected to a well thought through theory of change. And so we're not just talking about risk for risk's sake or innovation for innovation's sake, but finding ways to make sure that these connect strategically to the broader ambitions for transformational change that projects and programs are aiming to contribute to. Now, we've got some data emerging. It's still early, but this is showing that in terms of context risks around climate, environmental and social risks, and political and governance risks, so far the reporting that's coming from agencies is showing that we're more or less within the bounds of the risk appetite that the Council has set. The same is true for execution risks around capacity for implementation, fiduciary issues, and stakeholder engagement risks. Those as well, as reported by agencies, are in line with expectations. When it comes to innovation, however, there's a big gap. The reported levels of innovation risk are far below the appetite. Here, these are shown on a scale from 1 to 4. The appetite that the Council set is high at 4. And so this, in effect, is a mandate to innovate. And it's an invitation to make sure that you're being as bold as possible in project and program design. Now, more specifically here, getting to the risk table, because it's really important that we have consistency in how innovation risk is thought about and put into practice in terms of assessment. So conceptually, what STAP is advising is to make a real distinction here between the challenges and barriers that the theory of change is addressing versus the types of risks that remain even after mitigating measures are put into place. So as Mark was talking about, it's essential to work backwards from the goal that you're aiming to achieve, identifying those challenges and barriers, identifying what are the innovations necessary to pursue the pathways of change that are most likely and necessary, as well as the assumptions that go with that. And then to say, well, even with the best effort, what is the remaining risk that this might not work? The instructions laid out in the GEF risk appetite document are deceptively simple. It says, describe the nature of the risk. And what we mean here is the nature of the risk to doing the project as designed in the theory of change. The second step is identifying relevant mitigating measures. And the third is to assign a rating to the level of residual risk. Let's break these down in a little bit more detail. You've got the 3 steps there on the left side of this slide. And it's important to think about what are some of the likely pitfalls. And in fact, these are pitfalls that we have seen in practice in STAP's screening of PIFs and the risk tables that go into those. So in terms of describing the nature of the risk, one of the pitfalls is that sometimes there's a confusion or a focus on the challenges that the project is aiming to address. that are central to the theory of change, rather than the risks that remain after that basic theory of change or design logic is formulated. So our recommendation is to do the strong theory of change first, figure what are the things that are needed to mitigate the remaining risks during implementation, and those are the ones that we want to describe in the risk table. Secondly, in terms of identifying mitigating measures, a common pitfall is to describe mitigating measures as things that are already fundamental components of the design, when in fact what we're looking for is to say, once the design is in place, what are the things that can reduce the likelihood of failure by going ahead and implementing that basic design? So those are the mitigating measures. The last step is around assigning that rating to the level of residual risk. And here, one of the pitfalls that we frequently see is that the design documents or the PIF might assign the risk rating based on the likelihood or impact of the overall risk, not yet taking into account the mitigating measures. And so the solution really here is to make sure that you factor in the mitigating measures and then on that basis say, okay, what's the residual risk? What remains even after those mitigating measures have presumably in the future been put into effect? So I've been talking a lot about different types of ways to measure and assess these innovation risks. Let's talk a little bit more detailed about what some examples of those could be. So here, assessing institutional and policy innovation risk. Let's say, for example, you've got an energy sector reform that's moving away from perverse subsidies in carbon emitting technologies. So here are some examples of ways that you might envision failures of that innovation. There could be vested interests that block or subvert policy dialogue or reform processes that are aiming to produce the policy change. It could be that you've got good design for policies, but they're not adopted, or they are adopted, but they're not enforced. So there could be problems of governance that get in the way of that effective enforcement. It could be that there are voluntary standards on the part of corporations, for example, that are developed, but not well adhered to, despite some incentives that might have been put in place for the initiative. There might be unexpected resistance to change because of public awareness or cultural barriers as well. In terms of technological innovation risk, let's say, for example, you're deploying remote sensing to be able to monitor shifts in land use and result in biodiversity gains. Could be that failures would include things like you've got novel technologies that just don't deliver despite good design, or that might have undesirable side effects that get in the way of widespread adoption. It might be that the technology fails to commercialize. You've got some other competitor or alternative or lack of capacity that gets in the way of commercialization. It could be that you've got technologies that do deliver benefit, but too slowly. And so the pace of change is not enough to contribute to the overall transformational effect that you're aiming for. And in terms of financial and business models, let's say you're trying to support investment in seaweed farming, for example. It could be that the global economic conditions are shifting the incentives for public and private investment in ways that weaken the impacts that you're aiming for. It could be that you've got some blended finance instruments that are undermined by perceptions around greenwashing. Perhaps there's a loss of trust in the public-private collaboration that was meant to support this change. Or you could have business models that aren't picked up. There's not enough replication. Perhaps local supply chains are not able to support these innovations, or it works environmentally but not very well economically, and therefore doesn't pick up at the scale that's been anticipated. So how do all these pieces come together? Let me give you one worked example. This is showing the columns that appear in the risk table itself within the PIF. On the left there, you want to be able to identify the nature of the risk, first the category, but then also we recommend a brief description of what's the type of risk that we're talking about. You give the rating, which again refers to the residual risk, and you give a short description of what this entails. And now let me break this down a little bit to show what are the components here in this example. So this is one around social norms that might be more resistant than anticipated to the change that you're promoting. So a good description will briefly set the context, in this case referring to one project component around the social norms around recycling, and it will identify the risk. Here it's about social norms being more resistant than anticipated to the change. It's good practice to distinguish, when you're identifying the risk, the likelihood as well as the potential consequence of that if it does come to bear. In this case, a high risk, a high consequence. And then to describe the mitigation. Here we're, in this example, looking at a regular basis of monitoring through surveys, using citizen science approach to make sure there's widespread engagement and broad data, and some sort of adaptive management to be able to adjust the sort of messaging and stakeholder engagement processes that would be part of implementation. Nevertheless, what remains? And that's the residual risk. In this case, it's identified as substantial, but still necessary to test this solution. So here's an example of how all the different pieces come together. And I just want to end with a few key takeaways on this theme. The council, agencies and countries are already highly attuned to the risks that are broadly distributed around the different actors engaged in GEF innovations and investments. What we have now is a shared framework to be able to communicate about these, and council has been clear in establishing this framework and now has a basis to be able to better assess progress in practice and the balance around risks and results. This is all about not only managing risk, but making sure that the innovations that we're investing in are producing a scale of impact that fits more closely to GEF ambition. By assessing risks consistently, it also gives not only a basis for quick adaptation during project implementation, but also for learning. This is so critical, learning across different projects and across countries to be able to make sure that we're closing the cycle and being able to adapt more quickly, both in current projects and in the future ones. So the detailed guidance is available at the link you'll find here, clarifying risks in GEF projects with a focus on innovation risks. So again, if you have other questions, I hope you'll put those in the chat. And if you're interested in staying on, Mark and I will be able to do that, to discuss a bit further. Thanks very much. Looks like Mark has responded to a couple of questions around theory of change. Fred, is there anything more you want to say in closing off before we move on to the open question session?
Yeah, no, not really. I think there were some really useful points. from John, which you can read, and my reaction to them, which is just to be very supportive because he's totally right. And I think really if there's anyone else has got any comments or questions, just stick your hand up and let's hear them.
Let me just pause to say that we're just about at the end of the hour. So if folks need to move on, please do so. But if you'd like to stay, again, both Mark and I will hang on to address any follow-on questions.
I might have missed this as we were just getting started, Blake, but just to reassure people that part of the intention of running this was to record the presentation so that could be available for people to review, revisit, or review if they wish to, or indeed for people who couldn't make it to see. That will probably just be a few days before we get that up somewhere, and hopefully the GEF Sec can circulate the link to all of you or the STAP Secretariat. So please don't hesitate to have a look at that and have a look at the documents which will be there, and we'll put the presentation up there with a few notes in it as well. The question for you there, Blake, on the risk table.
Yep.
And Blake, do you want to address the couple of questions on risk issues in the chat, and then Hermes has a
Sure
comment to make.
Jacqueline, your question is about the actual risk table I was showing at the end of the presentation, the worked example, is it? Why don't you come back on if you're still here?
Yeah.
I can address
Yeah.
that. So you're
Can you
referring
hear
to
me?
this slide?
Yes, you have in parentheses old social norms to resistant.
Right.
Is that just put in there to clarify, or are you asking for us to add these sentences?
So this is what you see on the left here, institutional and policy, that's the the category.
Yes.
That's the required part. What's in parentheses is a STAP recommendation that it's nice to be able to summarize under the category of institutional and policy risk, what is the particular type that you're focusing on here? Because, you know, there could be so many things that could be, as I mentioned, about, you know, resistance against policy adoption, or it could be uncertainty about benefits from the policy, or it could be about social norms like this one. So because there's that wide variety, our recommendation as STAP is good practices to provide a little summary in there so it's clear for the reader which flavor we're focusing on. Does that help?
Okay. So maybe that could go in the assessment and mitigations box, because in the portal, we are unable to edit the area that you have added in.
Okay. If that's the case, technically, then yes, very much so. And you know, you'll see here that first sentence refers to the social norms, so that would be the place if you're not able to put it in the column to make sure you're clarifying the context for this particular risk.
Okay, awesome. Thanks.
Let me go to Charles. You had your hand up.
Oh, I just want to say that for me, this section that you mentioned was, I mean, what you were showing here, I mean, in the assessment.
Yes.
Yes, I'm saying that in this category, I mean, can you remove this set of context? I mean, on the. No, I don't. Yeah.
You want to go back?
No, what I'm saying is that the old social norm to resistant for me is already included in the assessment, right? Because in the assessment, what we want to do is we are really specify what is the risk, right?
In the assessment, do you mean, I'm not sure if you're
In
talking
the
about as part of the theory of change exercise or in this risk
in
table?
the risk table, yeah. So for me, in the risk, like here, you mentioned the institutional and policy. Okay, and then you say you in bracket here or in parentheses we have all social norm to resistant. What I'm saying is that this is already specified somehow in the assessments section or table column. Yeah.
Oh, I see. You're saying it's already in that first sentence.
Yeah, that's what I'm saying. Yeah.
Yes. And yeah, like the last question mentioned, you might not be able to include it on the left column in terms of the format, but it's really important to describe what's the nature of the risk that you're talking about in terms of also whether it's the whole project or a part of the project. Does that clarify? Okay, Ermias, please.
Yeah, I mean, thank you, Rick. Thanks also, Mike. I think for me, I was very happy to see theory of change and risk appetite coming together, and then that means really a lot. I mean, they're coming together. This also means a lot instead of having them separately. And then I think I found it really very innovative and enriching to bring them together. So that was really wonderful. And then I'm very happy, Blake, you mentioned that, go for the theory of change, then go to the, the risk appetite kind of thing is also a very practical way. So I was just wondering one question for Blake that, how do you see, the time dimension of, global environmental benefits influences risk appetite? For example, if I have a project by which I would like to plant trees to restore a landscape in a dry land, then it might take me 20 years, 30 years. But in 22 years, 30 years, the climate, the environment also might change. So I really wonder if we have any kind of, consideration of time in terms of taking risk appetite. I would be really happy to hear your thoughts around that. Thanks.
Thanks, Ermias. Mark, you might want to comment on this as well, but in terms of the the overall concept for the project, I kept using the word contributing to the transformational change that we're aiming for. I think many project developers get hung up on the idea of saying, well, this is a 4-year investment or whatever it is. We're not going to fully achieve that transformational change, and therefore let's reduce the description of what we're trying to achieve. And what STAP's perspective is, I think, is that we want to be able to clarify what is that longer term pathway. And it might be that there needs to be a succession of different projects or some combination of how this relates to other investments and changes already happening. But we want to consider it in that context in terms of how how this particular intervention will interact with others to produce the longer term effect. But Mark, I think this also relates to the question of simple narratives of future change.
Yeah, I mean, it brings several of those things together. And I'm sorry I missed part of your question, Ermias, as I was just replying to some of the other ones in the chat. But yeah, and I think it also speaks to this issue of articulating a theory of change, which does attempt to deal with all of those phases, even if you're then going to focus in on one component of it, and perhaps think about the theory of change for that in more detail than the sort of wider one. But I may not be answering exactly what you were asking because I missed some of it. I would like to pick up just sorry, Amas, but tell me in a moment if I haven't answered that. But I would like to pick up a point by Juliana as well, which I started talking about, but I decided it was something that was required too long a comment to try and type in. So Juliana asked about, just get your question here, about harmonizing the process of the environment and social screening and the related annexes and their mitigation plans with the information that's needed on the environmental and social risks in the risk table. A little bit of the reason why this is hard to answer concisely, Juliana, is that I think the differentiation between the environmental and social risks and things like the climate risks in the current risk categories is not terribly 100% clear. So I mean, there's a bit of an issue there with clarifying that. And so I mean, the important thing is that they're all thought about wherever they happen to be put. But your point, of course, is more about filling out the annexes and other sort of screening processes, and also covering it again in the project proposal risk table. I mean, I think the answer there is that the risk table is a useful place to summarize key things there without trying to redo the entire environmental and social screening, but just to pick up things which are particularly crucial and important that come out of that. But I don't know whether you want to make me expand on that a bit more or elaborate your question there. That's always assuming you're still online. Actually, I haven't noticed.
I am. Sorry, thanks.
Oh, yes.
That's useful. That's what we have been doing until now, like create a summary of the environmental and social risks that we identified during the screening process and the mitigation measures that are basically reflected in plans, but a very high level one. And then on the risk rating, that's a tricky one because we have received comments saying that the risk rating in the table needs to be the same as the one in the ESS screening annexes. And what I'm getting from you is that it's precisely the residual risks, so it should be different. Yeah. So basically, that's an elaboration of what I was asking. Thanks so much.
Cool. Well, I hope that helps in that case. Yeah.
Maybe I can pick up on this and also address a bit further the question that Monica put in the chat, because both this and the prior question relate to the context risk category, and maybe it's worth a few words to just clarify, the kind of the logic behind these three dimensions. So the context risk dimension is meant to refer to things that, in a sense, exist outside of the scope and prior to the project intervention. All right, that's stuff that's happening anyway. Okay, the climate change is underway. The environmental and social conditions are changing. Political and governance context is already there and dynamic. The innovation risks, this is addressing Monica's question in particular, are specific to the nature of the intervention that is being put forward, right? So these are chosen innovations. These are innovations that are adopted within the project design. I acknowledge, as you were just referring to, Mark, that on the environmental and social piece in particular, there is this tension because the aim of GEFSEC has been to make sure that there's this consistency with the existing standards, in this case around environmental and social safeguards and how those are measured. So I'm not sure it's completely satisfying, but I think that at least pinpoints the nature of this difficulty in terms of that particular category.
Perhaps I could just add to that, just since there's an opportunity to segue on it. I think that particularly the context risk is a good place to think about some of these grey areas. I mean, climate change, for example, no project really should be doing something without thinking about climate change, because we know it's happening. So that would be something which should be designed into the theory of change. But that doesn't change the fact that climate change may happen a bit faster than one's allowed for, or there may be some unanticipated sort of aspects of climate change that haven't been planned for, or there may just be things which are somewhat related to climate change but are actually extreme events or something like that, which just happen to occur during the implementation period of the project, but which aren't actually particularly related to the project. So that sort of distinguishes things which you would be actually planning for in the theory of change, as opposed to things which are implementation risks or risks from the context that you may know about, but you can't really you can't plan for in detail. Or in fact, the risk paper talks a little bit about the sort of cost benefit of doing something about them. And when it becomes realistic to treat them as a key thing to design for, as opposed to something that is reasonably unlikely to happen, and so you have a sort of remaining risk, and you have some mitigation to do that, but you do it in a way which doesn't cost too much or send the project off in a completely different direction. So I mean, I think there is a genuine issue there about getting the right balance of things which are truly design challenges, which should be in the theory of change, as opposed to risks that are still there afterwards. And as I say, that's talked about a bit in the risk document. I might also just pick up a comment here by, I'm not sure if I got your name right here, sorry, Onesimus Mwezi, on around necessary and sufficient. What's the appropriate level of risk and assumptions that would be appropriate for a theory of change and the results framework. I mean, I think there are a number of things in doing a theory of change, which I mean, I don't want to try and claim are completely cut and dried. There has to be expert judgment involved in this, and that's part of the sort of expert judgment that can come from having a team talking about it rather than one person making the decisions as to just how much detail and how big the scope is that you're trying to tackle and how comprehensively you do it. There has to be a bit of a little bit of expertise and I guess partly common sense, but partly also experience brought to what the level of that is. So I appreciate the question. The answer to some extent is to talk it through and find out what is a level of comprehensiveness that people are comfortable with and people feel is reasonably reliably dealing with the issues at hand. That's probably a slightly evasive answer, but I think it's true.
All right, I don't see any other questions yet in the chat. Is there anybody who would like to raise their hand or speak up with any final thoughts? Just give it a moment. If anybody has any other thoughts to put forward.
That's been some good questions and comments.
Yep.
So thank you for those, and one or two of them we should probably pick up as we go forwards. Stephen?
Hi, thank you again for your presentation. I was thinking about like a comment or adding on to a question that was asked before. I was like, how do you plan or how do you incorporate like unidentified risks? Like, for example, when a project is implemented and there's political change that happens during the project, and this hasn't been identified in the initial stages of the project. Like, can you talk more about how you go on unidentified risks as well? Or I think maybe this can be discussed in like other have you already discussed it, but I was just thinking about unidentified risks.
So let me make 2 points on that. One is just to go back to this table I had on the screen. That to take up that particular example, the political and governance context risk is one of the categories. It might be that you obviously can't see the future, but you know that this particular country has, for example, been assessed by some international organization with expertise in this area, that there's significant instability, or it's in a certain category for state fragility, for example. So all of that can be identified up front. Nevertheless, there can be big surprises, and of course, you can't put everything in the design document or in the PIF to be able to identify all of those. So the topic today is really focused on what goes into this design stage, right? We could have a whole different topic and discussion on adaptive management during project implementation. And you might argue that that's even more important than what goes into the design stage, that we're really effectively identifying risks as they emerge and adapting to them, and shifting project implementation plans or even project strategy. So we haven't tried to cover that here. The expectation, I guess, when STAP reads these documents is not that they're completely comprehensive. We understand this is an early stage of design, particularly the PIF, but that you've identified a reasonable set of possible risks and reasonable mitigating measures against those, but none of that will take the place of effective risk monitoring and adaptation during implementation.
And if I could just add to that, I mean, having an adaptive management style in the project implementation may well be one of the key mitigating measures that you do to cover quite a lot of risks anyway. So yeah, so you can't foresee everything, but you can have a more robust sort of project.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
Any last late questions?
Last call.
All right. Thank you so much to all who've hung on these extra 20 minutes. It's a pleasure always to be able to engage, and the questions help us to think further about what else we can help develop future guidance on.